Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to see how I made a mid-century modern inspired walnut lounge chair. This is something that I have wanted to make for a long time and finally have some downtime to get it done. I took inspiration from Wood Delight's lounge chair that he made a couple years ago. I randomly found the picture on Google and fell in love with the design. The first step, as you have seen me working on while I blabber away, is drawing out the design so I can use it as a template with my router. I used SketchUp to give me a really rough idea of what I wanted the design to look like, really paying attention to the angles and dimensions of the wood. I used a whole bunch of different items for the rounding at each joint, coins, paint cans, and a dog bowl, until I found a look that I liked. Front and rear leg are leaning in at an angle of 15 degrees. The armrest is at a 3-degree decline, and the backrest and seat are at an angle of 110 degrees. I'll put a bunch of my overall dimensions in the description below. I know that finding lounge chair plans is almost impossible. Trust me, I looked forever, but hopefully my measurements can help some of you out. Once the design was drawn on the 1/4 inch MDF and I was happy with it, I headed over to my buddy Dan's shop to borrow his bandsaw. I cut out each piece of the template, really only needing the front and back leg, as the 2 stretchers that connect the legs are dependent on the size I wanted and are easily cut to arbitrary lengths. After I had the templates cut out, I took them back to my shop and traced them onto the 6/4 walnut that I had left over from a previous job. Then I realized that I should have just brought that walnut with me instead of having to drive back and forth. Back to my buddy's shop to use the bandsaw to cut out the shapes, leaving about a 1/16 of an inch outside the lines that I had drawn. Next I took some double-sided carpet tape and taped the templates onto the walnut pieces so that I could begin routering out the exact shape. This tape works really well at keeping everything secure. When the template was taped on, I took my palm router and a flush trim bit to cut down about 3/4 of an inch. I made sure not to go into the joint, as I was going to cut those a lot more safely and accurately on the table saw later on. Once I had all of the legs mostly cut out, I used my larger router in my router table and a flush trim bit to contact the area that I had just cut out. Using the templates like this ensures everything is exactly the same. Now I needed to cut each joint on the legs. I used a technique I saw Chris from 4 Eyes Furniture use. I set my table saw fence and cut a piece of MDF to act as a temporary sled. Without moving the fence, I then took my template and lined up the joint with the edge of the MDF sled. Using some plywood and double-sided tape, I put blocks on to make sure that the template wouldn't move. Now I could take that sled with my walnut piece on it to the saw and cut the joint, making sure that the sled was running against the fence. Works like a charm to give the exact angle and a perfect joint. After milling, I had noticed that one of my back legs had a small crack in it that needed to be dealt with so that the crack wouldn't get larger. I decided to add a little flair and put in a purple heart bow tie. I first traced it out, then used my palm router and a straight bit to hog out most of the waste. Then turned to my chisels to get crisp lines. Added some glue and pounded it into place. I really like the small detail in the final product. Now I could turn my attention to the 4 stretchers that I needed, 2 on each side of the chair. First, I cut them to width on the table saw, and then to length at the miter saw. Next, I added in the first of many dominoes that I was going to use in this project. I can honestly say that this tool made this project completely possible for me. I know that you could use dowels or biscuits or another form, but the domino really sped things up and made it a lot easier to deal with. I made some wedges that were cut at a 15-degree angle and used some double-sided tape to secure them to the outside of the legs to help make sure enough clamping pressure was going to be added. This made a huge difference and was a lot easier than fighting with multiple clamps. While the glue was drying, I started working on the backrest and seat. First, I milled some white oak, face jointing, edge jointing, and then planing to get them to the right thickness. To quote Michael Scott, this is where I should have had hindsight, as this was the one aspect of the build that I wasn't completely thrilled with. I should have ripped these pieces of white oak to a little bit wider to allow me then to use the chair with or without cushions. I knew that I wanted cushions, so it's not really a big deal, but ideally it should have been a little bit wider. Once the slats were cut, I used a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my palm router to give them a little softer look, and then added a domino to each one and glued the seat and the back together. The next part of the build was by far the most complicated and took a ton of double checking and asking for advice from some other woodworkers. In the end, it worked out well, and the domino was an invaluable tool in this process. I laid the seat out where I wanted it and then traced the top of the seat onto the side of the chair. This line is crucial to get the same on each side. Then I flipped the seat down so that the top line I just drew was just visible. Then I marked out on the seat where I wanted the dominoes, and with the fence of the domino up, I plunged down into the seat side and without adjusting anything added the mortises to the seat as well. I did the same thing for the backrest and then clamped everything together. I also cut out the top armrest parts on a bandsaw and glued them on, but for some reason that footage was lost. My final step was to sand and finish, and then impatiently wait for the cushions to be done. This accent chair turned out exactly how I wanted it. I love the overall design and can't wait to add it into our living room. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button.